Thank you all for coming. Your input is important to this process so that we can incorporate that into our final sewer study. This evening we've got a host of folks here that were part of the team to put the sewer study together. With us, city staff, we've got folks from the engineering department, utilities, our communications folks, and with our consultant, Hubbell Roth Clark, we've got several people that were involved in the process, and we've got a couple of them here tonight, Tom Maxwell and Mr. Keith. And with OHM Advisors, we've got Greg Kaczynski, and I think we've got a gentleman here from the Midland office that wasn't really part of the study, so John Kelly. Up to this point, our work performed was the team scope. Back in October, we put together the scope of this study after that June event that we had in 2017. So we've evaluated the event, we've modeled the sanitary and the storm sewer, and we've developed a capital... Mic check, mic check. Maybe I get a little closer. I could... All right, I'm too tall. All right, I'll just hold it, Yep, sorry about that, folks. Sorry about that. I'm not sure what part you didn't hear. Again, my name is Joe Sova, City of Midland Utilities Director. And this part of the slide is going through what we've performed so far in the study. And we've developed a capital improvement plan to address deficiencies. Your input is going to help us in the direction, help City Council in what direction we want to take once the study is complete. And then we'll look at possible phase 2, either studies or flow monitoring or that we would look at for the future. And currently we do have a draft report out. We are looking for your input so that we can put the final report together. And to reach all of what we've done so far and the reports is out on the city's website, and sewer study is the key word. If you could also key that in anywhere in a search, and it'll get you to the study. Or you could put it in your URL, cityofmidlandmichigan.gov/sewer study. That'll bring you here. You see those 2 red arrows. One of them's for the sanitary report, and one is for the storm sewer study report. And then after we get your input, we've got this session tonight. We've got one next Tuesday, the 31st, and we will incorporate your feedback to us into the final revision of the report. And then that will be then presented to City Council, and then we'll look for some action on where to go next. So we've done June 11th, we've done a preliminary study of findings, and we discussed that at Council. And that June 2017 storm event was what we would call it would be an 82-year event, which is a 1.2% chance of occurrence, and it's a significant stormwater and sanitary flooding occurred from this event. I'm going to have Greg Kaczynski come up and go through the stormwater portion of the study, and then we'll have Tom Maxwell from HRC come up and do the sanitary portion of the study. Thank you.
All right, thanks for taking time out of your evenings to come here and listen to us, and hopefully we'll get some good feedback from you tonight. I'm going to try to hold this close enough to my mouth so you can actually hear me. So my name is Greg Kaczynski. I'm the practice leader for Stormwater with OHM Advisors, and we were working very closely with HRC to find out how the city's stormwater and wastewater systems, how they're working for the city, and what are the, trying to describe what and how went wrong during the June 2017 event, and what can be done to invest in the system to make sure that there's an adequate level of service for the city's residents and businesses. So one of the things that we do when we start a study like this is we we look at a major event, and obviously there was the big event in June of 2017. So we throw out numbers like the 82-year event. We talk about the 10-year storm, the 100-year storm. Have you heard those sorts of things in the news before, like the 100-year storm? Are you familiar with that? So when we throw out a term like that, it's kind of a misnomer, because 100-year storm, you think, well, that's a storm that should happen about once in every 100 years. But that's not really true. 100-year storm has a 1 in 100 chance of occurring in any given year. You could have 100-year storms back to back, 2 years in a row. It's not likely, but it's possible. So whenever we're talking about events like this and using this time frame, like a X-year storm, it's important to realize that's just a probability. So when we say a 100-year storm, 1 in 100 chance. If we say a 10-year storm, that's a 1 in 10 chance. But it's important to know that the chances of that kind of storm happening in 2 years back to back is not insignificant. And so it's important to understand the statistics. So when we looked at the June 2017 rain event, they're in the stormwater system, and I'm going to focus mostly on stormwater. Tom here is going to get into wastewater. The important thing to realize is that stormwater and wastewater are pretty closely interrelated, because what impacts one system impacts the other. Because when you get a lot of flooding on the surface, that water tends to find its way into the other system, which causes problems. And so we did look at that as part of this study. This is a picture, I believe, up along Joe Mann Boulevard near the mall. And this is an example of the kind of flooding that happens due to undersized or blocked storm sewers. This flooding had nothing to do with the Tittabawassee or Sturgeon Creek flooding, because this is up much higher than those floodplains. So this is the type of flooding that we looked at in the Stormwater Master Plan in terms of, is the city's sewer piping system, storm sewer piping system, big enough to handle the amount of water that gets into the sewers when it rains? And in this case, there was not enough capacity. Doesn't matter how much flow there was in the Tittabawassee or Sturgeon, because this sits so much higher than those floodplains. This is due to either an undersized or a block storm sewer. So I just want to kind of make that point, because we're going to talk about the two different types of flooding. This map is a compilation of all of the flooding complaints received throughout the city, and they're based on severity. So the reds and the oranges are more severe than the greens or the blues. But there's some blue circles. I don't know if you can see them on the presentation here. They show up on my screen, maybe not so much on this one. But there's some areas along the Sturgeon Creek, just south of Highway 10, and some areas kind of on the northeast of Wheeler and Eastman that also had a lot of flooding. So we focused on some of these areas in the study. Some of these flooding complaints are related to wastewater, and some are related to stormwater. In not every case do we know what caused the flooding, because the complaints may not have been able to tell us that. So when you have basement flooding or basement backups, it could very well be a wastewater issue, but it could also be a stormwater issue. But anyway, we focused on the city's infrastructure in some of these areas where there's a higher density of complaints. It's important to note this here. When the Tittabawassee and Sturgeon Creeks flooded out of their banks, the reason for that is that the watershed area tributary to those water bodies is really significant. The City of Midland, which is the red area here, compared to the watershed areas for the Chippewa and Tittabawassee, which flow through the city, all that rainfall that occurred outside of the city, which the city has no control over, that's what caused those rivers to crest and flood. The city's storm sewer system had very little to do with that, because the city delivers a very small portion of the flows that get to those rivers. But there was a lot of rain over a 7-day period, in some cases over 7 inches of rain. So in a large watershed like this, when you get that much rain over a long period of time, it's gonna fill those rivers and swell the banks. So going back to this, the the Tittabawassee watershed, which is the one on the north. I'm going to point to it with the laser here. That's this one. And here's the Chippewa. They come together and then they flow right through the City of Midland. So the City of Midland's basically at the downstream end of both of these watersheds. And I talked about this, the local versus the watershed flooding. The local flooding that happens when a storm sewer doesn't have enough size or capacity to handle the water that comes down by rainfall, the city has control over that. What the city does not have control over is the level that the flow gets to in the Tittabawassee. That is due to the rainfall in the watershed. On the Sturgeon Creek, there is a lot of flow. There was also some debris in the culverts and bridges that did cause the water to back up. So there is some control there. However, all the flows that come down through those creeks and rivers, the city does not have any control over the amount of flow that comes down those rivers. It's kind of an important thing to state. One of the reasons we're looking carefully at the stormwater system, flooding is a bad thing in any case, but because we're looking at the wastewater system too, it's really important that we look carefully at where it might flood. And if it floods in certain neighborhoods, on the streets, in backyards, in parking lots, etc., how long does that water hang around and how deep is it? Because all these manholes that you see in the street, if you got a lot of water for a really long period of time, that water can get into the wastewater system. We don't want it to get in there, because if it does, the city has to treat it, and it can overwhelm the city's wastewater system. So part of the goal with the Stormwater Master Plan is to improve the city's stormwater system so the water can get through without flooding to the surface and interacting with the wastewater system. So we're trying to minimize that. We'll talk a little bit more in detail about that in a few more slides. So we talk about this term, it's called level of service. Really, it's how well is the sewer serving the community? What level of protection does it provide? For stormwater systems, most communities go with what we call a 10-year storm. So I'm using this term again, 10-year. It means a 1 in 10 chance of being exceeded in any given year. So again, in any given year, there's still a pretty decent chance, a 1 in 10 chance of the system being overwhelmed based on that standard. But we worked with the city, and the city currently has in its ordinance a reference to the 10-year event. So we used that 10-year event to set the level of service. So we want to take that much rainfall in the system, get it through the stormwater system without causing an excessive amount of flooding. And we determined that to be about 5 inches of flooding. 5 inches allows you to drive cars through a low spot where there's a little water on the road. But any more than that, it gets hard to drive through it. You might splash a little bit too much or maybe get water up into your transmission or engine, which we wouldn't want. It also reduces the potential of that water, that stormwater, getting into the wastewater system. So that's why that level of service was set up. And we analyzed the city's stormwater system based on this standard. You could always argue that the standard should be higher or lower, but 10-year is probably the most commonly used by communities for stormwater systems. So our recommendations based on what we found, looking at the 10-year event, is we have a map up here that if you want to take a look at it later, we can show you. We set up a recommended projects throughout the city to replace storm sewers. And I've got a map on the next slide, we can get into that. So we talk about this capital improvement plan. So a capital improvement plan is simply a long-term plan. It could be 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years. And usually with infrastructure, it's on a longer time frame because it takes a long time to fund and construct these things. So we have a capital improvement plan that has recommendations to basically replace some of the storm sewers with bigger pipes to get the water downstream faster and to prevent some of the neighborhood flooding that's been observed from time to time. In addition to that, we're also recommending some what we call detention ponds. Those are ponds that can help to store that water and slow it down. So we can minimize the amount of investment made in the storm sewer system. That also helps to keep the flow rates lower so we don't overwhelm downstream creeks and rivers like the Snake Creek or the Sturgeon Creek. So the capital improvement plan basically looks at prioritizing projects to those areas with the greatest flood potential based on what we would predict. So this is a map of the priority improvements. So this is citywide. So we can go into more detail if you want to talk about your neighborhood and what's being proposed in and around your neighborhood. This is focused primarily on culverts along the Snake Creek, several of which were deemed to be undersized, and storm sewers throughout the city. The lighter green are what we call the priority 1 areas, and the darker green are the priority 2 areas. So our recommendation is to work on some of these priority 1 areas first. I do want to mention Sturgeon Creek as well, which is right over here on the west side of town. We did not identify any particular culverts to be replaced there yet. And the reason for that is when we went into the study, given the budget constraints, the Sturgeon Creek is so big in terms of the watershed that it would eat up too much of the budget to study that in a great amount of detail at this stage. But we did have access to some videos from the flooding where we could draw some conclusions and make some recommendations to look at some of those areas a little more closely. So Sturgeon Creek is important, although it does not pop up on this capital improvement plan. There are going to be some projects for maintaining that creek and keeping it open for flow and looking at those culverts and bridges. So that's something that will be explored. Some other recommendations that we're going to make, that we have made, it's not just about replacing storm sewers to make them big enough to handle rainfall events, but it's also inspecting them on a frequent basis. The city's more proactive than most in that they flush the system and clean it out on a regular basis. But what most communities don't do, and this is because they don't have funding sources for it, and Midland is no exception to that, is that there's not money available to televise the system. They basically drag a camera through pipes. Typically do that for wastewater pipes. But stormwater systems are a little different because there's not a funding source associated with stormwater systems. So where we're recommending is a more frequent sewer televising program to find out if there are sewers that are clogged or have structural problems where they need to be replaced. Because some of the flooding that occurs, and some of the flooding that we think occurred up on Joe Mann Boulevard up near the mall, we think is due to a sewer blockage. So that's why that is important. The city's stormwater system's getting older. Cities throughout Michigan and the country have infrastructure that is aging, and we're not able to replace it at the rate we need to keep it in decent shape. So inspecting and televising it is a low-cost way of keeping up with or keeping on top of projects that need to happen on an emergency basis. We want to get to those projects before they become real emergencies and flood residences. So this O&M, or operations and maintenance program, is really an important part of the recommendations. So when we put all these projects together, and the figure that I just showed you with the light green and the dark green, when you put all those projects together, which are culverts, detention ponds, and storm sewers, in priority 1, there was $29 million worth of projects identified. Priority 2 projects, there was another $50 million worth of projects identified. So replacing storm sewer is not cheap. It requires that you rip up the road. In most cases, you're digging down 6 or 7 or 8 feet or more below the road surface, putting in a new pipe. These are usually not small pipes. They're much larger than sanitary sewers. They're usually heavy concrete pipes, so they're not cheap to build. That's why we're looking at costs in this range. This also includes some of the culverts on Snake Creek that were found to be undersized. And as I said before, there's still some areas along the Sturgeon Creek that need to be looked at in terms of debris removal and maybe looking at those culverts and bridges to making sure they're big enough to handle the flows that are coming through. And so that will be something that will need to be explored in the future. To wrap up the stormwater discussion, an important thing that I wanted to mention is that this is a cutaway of a typical roadway, and there are lots of utilities. If you were to cut open your road in front of your house or in front of the school here, you're going to see a dozen utilities. You're going to see gas, electric, sanitary, sewer, water main, stormwater, maybe fiber optic, cable. every one of those utilities has a revenue source, right? You pay a gas bill for your gas, you pay an electric bill, you pay a cable bill, you pay a sewer bill and a water bill for using those pipes. The only pipe underground that does not have a funding source dedicated to it is a stormwater system. And in many cases, the stormwater system is the biggest and most expensive to replace. And so this is something that's going to need to be explored in the future in order to tackle the magnitude of the capital improvement program we're talking about. And so that'll be a topic of future discussion, and we've made some recommendations to the city and given them some options. So that's basically a rundown of the storm sewer. I'm going to be around here to answer questions, any specific questions you might have on specific neighborhoods. Are we opening up questions after both presentations? Okay. So I'll be around after Tom is done to answer any questions on stormwater drainage. So thank you.
Well, I think this thing was, excuse me. Can you hear me? No? Okay. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. My name's Tom Maxwell. Still can. I guess you got to put it right up next to your lips. All right. My name's Tom Maxwell. I'm with Hubbell Roth Clark, and basically I worked with Greg and the city team to come up with capital improvements for the wastewater or the sanitary sewage collection system. Basically, first thing I'd like to start off is to talk a little bit about the sewer system. It's a complex system. It was started as a combined sewer system. That's a single pipe system. So basically in the 1930s, and what it does is during dry weather flow, it takes on the sanitary sewage from the residents, industry, etc. During wet weather or storm event, it also takes on the stormwater runoff. So it's a single pipe system that serves both functions. And that was started in 1930. In 1950, like many communities, everybody started to build separate sanitary sewers and separate storm sewers. In the 70s, like many other communities, the city started to separate the combined system. So what they typically did is they would leave the combined system in place and they would use that for either sanitary, which was pretty typical, and then put in new storm, or vice versa. So then you would separate the system to have both sanitary and stormwater independent sewers. They completed that in 1995. So just some stats of the sewer system. It is complex, and I think the thing that really makes it complex is the fact that you folks have 42 pump stations. That's an enormous amount of pump stations, and it's a phenomenal effort on your city staff to maintain and keep those operable 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, and just keep those things operable. And during that June 2000 event, they were all operable. They all functioned as they were supposed to. But I'm not going to read you all these different elements, but you can see it's a massive system, serves 14,000 acres. So, why would a sanitary sewer system be wet? Isn't that for the storm sewers, right? It's kind of confusing when you think about it, but there's a phenomena called infiltration and inflow, and basically we'll go through that real quick. But the only other thing that you should be aware of, and Greg brought this up and did a great job at expressing it, the level of service or the design event that's required for a sanitary system is a 25-year event. So for that storm or event that you have to design your sanitary system to not allow any sanitary sewer overflows to the environment. And you would have basically 4% chance in any given year for that event to occur. So now I'm just going to go through real quick infiltration and inflow sources. You can see this is basically if I can get the pointer to work. Residential setting. You can see on the top here, we've got our gutters, we've got a downspout. That light gray band is a footing drain. That system's tied into your lateral that goes out to the sanitary sewer in the road, which is adjacent to the storm sewer. So let's first talk a little bit about the infiltration sources. Another common way of describing this is rainfall-dependent infiltration and inflow, RDII. Engineers love acronyms. So infiltration sources are related to groundwater, okay? And they can get into your system through broken laterals, root intrusion, faulty connections, cracked pipe, deteriorated manhole, etc. And as I mentioned, it's impacted by the groundwater table. So inflow sources, those are more direct. Basically, when you have an inflow source into your sanitary sewer, you see those sources really quick, and they're related to surface runoff elements. They could be associated with the roof drain connection into your lead into the sanitary sewer. Footing drain connection, which up until 1987, the city allowed footing drains to be directly connected into the sanitary sewer, and that's not uncommon. Many communities have the same impact to their system and allowed that as well. You could have a clean out on your lateral with no cap on it. Here's a common phenomena that occurs, and it can really impact your sanitary sewer when you have a cross connection between the storm sewer and the sanitary. And then just a faulty manhole. So this phenomena, you can imagine this is the Tittabawassee River. When the Tittabawassee heads up and basically gets above flood control, it greatly impacts the system. And Greg did a good job of talking about that, because all this water could either get in even into the windows, into your basements directly from runoff, but also get into that uncapped clean out, get into the footing drains, and also into manhole covers, pump stations, anything that would be along the Tittabawassee River. And you folks, it's very common for communities to put their major interceptor along with the river because it flows with gravity down to the low point, which is where typically you'd put the wastewater treatment plant. And unfortunately, I think that's a significant influence on the system when the river heads up and surcharges when a high stage occurs. Okay. Now these yellow highlighted elements are basically, because this is a private residence, these are things that you folks have influence and control over. You know, you can go in and, you know, sometimes you snake out, sometimes you line your laterals. You can put a cap on that uncapped clean out on your lead out to the sanitary sewer. These are elements that you have in control of your system, and if you can do that, that will definitely help the situation. If your downspouts directly connected into your footing drain, that's a huge impact. And I got a little video that I think will be an eye-opener if you think about what's going down into that footing drain. So this is just an 1,800 square foot home. There's 3 of these downspouts that were in the back of this home. This is one of the 3. And this services about 700 square feet on the home. You could see that was a relatively intense rain event, but you could also see the volume of water that's coming out of that downspout. So if that's coming down and getting into your footing drain, that's tied in the sanitary sewer. And unfortunately, you folks have about 9,000 homes built before 1987 directly connected into the sanitary sewer system. That's a problem. So here are some solutions. You know, basically we're just going to go through these real quick to kind of give you a flavor of solutions, and a picture's worth 1,000 words, so that's what these are for. So for infiltration inflow reduction, you can do a footing drain disconnection program. You know, other infiltration inflow removal techniques, lining the sewers is one, which is a good thing because it extends the service life of your sewer. Floodproofing structures that are in that drainage course in your situation is Tittabawassee River. Now here's another item that you can do. This is alternative B in the report. It's called improved conveyance. So basically what we're trying to say here is that some of the sewers that you have in the ground, the existing sewers, they don't have the hydraulic capacity to take that peak flow from the infiltration and inflow that's getting into your sewers. So it heads up the sewer system, and unfortunately sometimes it gets into your basements. So how you remedy that problem is you can increase the sewer capacity by installing a newer, larger sewer, or you can put in a parallel sewer. The other thing you can do is go in and increase your pump station capacity. I guess the key for improved conveyance is to make certain that whatever improvements you do, you just don't carry the problem downstream. You make certain that the sewers downstream have the capacity to take on that additional peak flow. Another commonly used technique is storage. Typically it's offline storage in the form of a retention tank or a large pipe. So what does infiltration inflow reduction do? It removes the flow from the system. And that's ideal because then you just get away from the source. You don't carry it down to the wastewater treatment plant and have to treat additional flow, as Greg mentioned. So it's a great thing to do. It's not always an easy one. The improved conveyance, like I said, it eliminates that surcharging of the sanitary sewer and it conveys that peak flow downstream. And in storage, what that does is it peels the excess flow off of the system and puts it into a holding facility, whether it's a large pipe or a tank. And then when the capacity in the collection system, the event's over, we're going back down to dry weather flow conditions, we got capacity in the collection system again, you dewater that storage tank back into the system. So those are alternatives A, B, and C that we did in the report. So this is a pretty typical home. As I mentioned, there's 9,000 of these in the city, approximately. But here's your downspout. And you can think back of that video that I put in there. If that was directly connected into the footing drain, which a lot of times they used to be, they don't always now. A lot of people disconnected them and extended them out, you know, preferably 3 to 6 feet from the edge of the house. But this has the footing drain connected into the sanitary lead that goes out to the sanitary sewer. And that's a problem. The only other thing to think about is that even if you've got this disconnected and it extends out from your house, you've got the limits of the original excavation of your home, right? And they put granular material back in there. And as you can all relate, trying to dig into Michigan soils, a lot of times it's just a sandy loam or a clay. So oftentimes in Michigan, basically what you do is you're creating a clay bathtub so that any of this water that comes out of that downspout goes onto the ground and then percolates or infiltrates down into the ground and eventually gets into that footing drain. So you're not going to see it like you saw it in that video. It's not going to come directly and that quickly into it, but you're going to see it eventually over time. So here's an improvement. You go in and you disconnect that footing drain from the sanitary sewer. You put in a new sump with a new sump pump. And then you would discharge that out either to the backyard, which is what I do at my house, or sometimes they take it out to the front into the ditch, the storm drainage system. So here you can see they're taking that line out to the front of the house. I don't know if it's a ditch or a storm sewer, but you can see it's pretty disruptive. Here's some gentlemen going down and actually, I think, doing a pretty good job of minimizing the impacts to the basement, but they're digging up in areas where they're going to put in a new sump pump right here, and they're going down into where the sanitary lead goes down and ties in and disconnecting the footing drain connection. And what you see right there is the finished product. So it's definitely painful while it's going and happening, but in the end run, it's not too bad. You put it in your mechanical room, it's out of sight, out of mind. But you just got to make certain now you've got an extra maintenance thing that you are responsible for to make certain that if it's not working, you don't flood yourself out. The only good thing about it is if it happens, it's groundwater. It's not sewage. A slight compromise. And just to note, as I mentioned, any house typically built after 1987 is built that way with a sump pump. Now you can see this is a manhole with a chimney that's extended above grade, and typically you would do this like in the banks of the Tittabawassee to try and get that manhole cover above a certain flood stage, and then basically flood-proof that chimney to minimize that infiltration or that inflow that's getting into the system. And I think this is a good video and an eye-opener as well. This is a community. It's not Midland, but it does happen, and it is a community that we're working with in southeastern Michigan. And somehow that flips sideways, but it essentially looks like Niagara Falls. And that water's coming in through a joint in the sewer system. So that would be a case of infiltration. So a way of going in and addressing that, you can see with this animated picture, this is a grouting operation. They put this bladder down in the sewer, and then they pressure grout these leaking areas. And this picture basically is that bladder that you saw in that animated picture. And it had just completed, this is post condition, where they grouted that joint that was so heavily, water was coming through with the infiltration. Another thing that you can do is go in and line your sewers. All of these little cracks and joints, which can occur over time, basically are allowing infiltration into the line. But the nice thing about putting a liner in like this, you seal out that water intrusion, but you also increase the service life of your sewer. So in essence, you've got another 50 years for the sewer, because these sewers don't last forever, folks. We put them in the 1930s and they're still working. So we've got a pretty good bang for our buck, and you think about it. But some of these have issues, and this is a way of addressing both. Here they're just flood-proofing the chimney of a manhole. Now this is, I think, a good example of conveyance. Communities going in to basically improve the carrying capacity and minimize any backups into the basements of homes. This is a larger sewer, and they're replacing the existing one. I guess the reason for this slide is to show you that it's great, but it's also a little painful. The disruption to the neighborhoods and whatnot, you're tearing up the roads. It's not real fun for the neighborhood. But the nice thing is, when you're done, if you do that, you typically put in new utilities along with this, because you don't want to go back in and rip up new roads, and you've got new roads. So that is one, I guess, good advantage of this. As I mentioned, you can improve the conveyance of a pump station. Now this is this is the Moreland pump station, and it is calling for some improvements, but the improvement to this one, I think we can go in and basically swap out the pumps for larger ones and do the work, and you folks probably wouldn't even know it ever occurred. And then there are times when either the pump station basically doesn't have the capacity to address the peak flows, whether it's due to I&I, whether it's due to development, whatever the reason being, or maybe it's just served its useful life and it's time for a new one. But you can see that's very disruptive. Storage. Offline storage, in this case, in the form of a tank. So when the conveyance of those sewer systems is starting to get exceeded, instead of going into your basements, it goes into this holding facility. So that's during the event. After the event, when the collection system recedes and you've got capacity in your collection system, You would dewater this facility back into the collection system. And this is just a picture of what you might see from the surface for a project of that nature. It's minimal. And all of these are explained at great lengths in that Section 7 or Chapter 7 of the Volume 3 report. So, the improvements. Essentially, we've got Priority 1 and Priority 2 areas, and those are the capital improvements that were addressed for the most part in the study. The Priority 1 areas are the ones that we're saying you should go after right now, and Priority 2 would precede Priority 1. These areas basically showed flooding we looked at the model as it related to the complaints and verified all those areas to coincide with the June 2017 event. For this area, the Priority 2 areas, we saw that it was starting to surcharge for the June 2017 event, but it didn't necessarily mean that it surcharged. But for the design event that I mentioned earlier, the 25-year event, these areas definitely were prone to flooding. So we've got to address those too. And then phase 2 are areas that we couldn't get to agree to some of the flooding complaints that occurred, and we're suggesting that you go in and do some additional investigation in those areas. The next series of slides I'll show you are related to the Priority 1 and 2 areas. Basically, we went in and we analyzed all those 12 areas for essentially 4 different alternatives. The I&I reduction was alternative A, improved conveyance, alternative B, and then alternative C was the storage that I showed you. Sometimes it took more than one of these alternatives to address the area. So we used a combination, and that's what alternative D was. And it doesn't look like you can, at least I can't read it very well from here, and I wasn't planning on going through every one of these. But this is a matrix that's in Chapter 7. It shows all the 12 priority areas along this column, and then all the alternatives that were analyzed for each one of those areas. Table 7-2 basically showed project costs to do improvements as it relates to each one of the alternatives reviewed for those priority 12 areas. And then Table 7.3 is a culmination or a summary of all the alternatives reviewed, and you can see that essentially you're looking at a capital improvement plan in anywhere from $34 million to $38 million for those 12 areas. So a lot of you folks want to know, okay, so what does that mean? What does that mean to my bills? And basically, we created this table for the average residential user, and you can see for quarterly and yearly increases. This is for a 25-year bond at 4% interest. And remember, it is an increase to your existing bill. And we highlighted that $35 million because that's kind of in that planning level cost range. So you'd be looking at somewhere around $29 per quarter, or approximately $116 per year. Another way to look at it is for every $5 million of improvement, it would be about $4 per quarter. Because you're not going to take on this entire capital improvement program tomorrow or in 1 year. It's something that's going to take, I don't know if it'll be decades, but it's going to be at least a 5 to 15 year kind of a program. So then there was the phase 2 area that I mentioned that we suggested that you do additional investigation, and that's talked at length in Section 8 of the report. There's 5 areas. And what that consists of is going in and evaluating the area, typically putting in meters, and trying to break down the system to figure out where in the system is this problem. You know, where's the grief coming from? So then, once you neck down these wet areas in the system, whether it be inflow or infiltration or both, you would go out and you would investigate that area. You do smoke testing, dye testing, sewer televising, which the city already does a tremendous amount. Every 2 years, the city televises your sanitary sewer system in its entirety. Right, Patrick? Yeah. Which is extremely proactive compared to most communities, and that's a great thing. So with going out and doing this investigation and checking into these areas of concern, you're going to get additional data. And that's going to help you out with the priority 1 areas and other areas that you might find. So during the investigation, you're going to look at the priority 1, the priority 2, the phase 2 areas I mentioned, and it also might reveal other areas during that investigation that we weren't aware of. The more data that we get, the better off that sanitary model that we created is going to be. Because right now, we've got some good data, but you know, the modelers always want more. And the more we've got, the better we can make it reflect your system. By taking a look at that and confirming the project sizing, we may be able to reduce it. If the phase 2 improvements, so they're going to go out and do the investigation, they're going to do improvements, they're going to eliminate sources of infiltration and inflow. They're going to do lining, pressure grouting, etc., to eliminate those sources. And as a result, hopefully that'll reduce the capital improvements that we're thinking about right now, those priority 1 and 2 areas. Reducing the project sizing obviously will reduce the overall costs, which is the idea and the hope. However, more detailed information could make it such that we've helped, but we underestimated to begin with, and we actually need a slightly larger improvement. So there's always another side to that equation. What this priority in phase 2 investigation, the city is anticipating starting that, which they already have started going down that path, as I understand it. They're getting meters, they're getting instrumentation and controls for the pump stations, and we would estimate that that's going to take about a 3 to 4 year period. It's not going to happen overnight, but you know, you really need to have rain events in order to fully evaluate and investigate these areas. So we're at the mercy of Mother Nature, right? Once we're done with those, that investigation and those improvements that we make, we can go back and reassess the original capital improvements, and those construction projects would follow. As I mentioned, the city has already started the efforts or the tasks associated here in yellow. So I'm almost done. Just a final note, and I think Greg did a great job of summarizing the different events, if you will, or the design events associated for a storm sewer, sanitary sewer, et cetera, and what they mean. But basically, for a storm sewer system, you design for a 10-year event, and as he talked about it, you have a 10% chance of occurrence in any given year, or 1 in 10, as he mentioned. For the sanitary sewer design, you have to address the 25-year event, and you have a 4% chance of occurrence in any given year. Naturally, the June 2017 storm event was an 82-year event, which was greater than both of those. And for that event, you would have approximately a 1.2% chance of having that occur in any given year. So all this is trying to say is, you know, we can go in, we can make the improvements, but remember, we can always have a larger event, unfortunately, and that can always still impact us. So the anticipated next steps. We're going to hold another public meeting on Tuesday of next week at 6 o'clock. It's pretty much going to be identical to this one, and it's going to be held at the Dow High School at 6 p.m. The city is going to take public comments until August 7th, and we're going to do our best to accumulate all of those, evaluate all of them, and try and incorporate them in as best we can to the capital improvements in the plan going forward. And this is how you access that survey on the website. So late August, early September, we're going to finalize the report. We're going to take it to the council for approval. From 2018 through 2022, the next 3.5, 4 years, we're going to do the investigations and evaluate those study areas and the priority areas. As those areas are investigated and the improvements are determined, the city intends to go through and eliminate those I&I efforts through improvements. Then in 2023, with all this additional data and knowledge of the system, the model that was created for the sanitary system would be improved, updated, and then the capital improvements would also be reviewed to make certain that the right thing and the right approach is what is happening for the city. And then from 2023 onward would be the capital improvements. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Sova.
We're going to play a video for you, basically just to show how resilient our community has been. We've had a number of events in the past. Some of you have gone through maybe 3 or 4 events in the history of Midland, and this video will kind of show how we come together in these times. Okay, that was a nice city production there. A lot of nice photos, some bad memories, but for the most part, we're looking toward moving forward so we don't have to play something like that in the future. On your screen, you'll see, and it's in your packet, page 31. There is a survey out there, so if you feel after you've left here you haven't really voiced what you expected or wanted to, something comes to your mind later, you can go to the site and plug that URL in, and that'll get you to a survey where you can give us your comments. Now, what we're going to do with this aspect of the evening is we're going to allow you to give us your thoughts. If you have a question for us, we'll point it to our consultants to answer as best as they can. City staff will fill in if needed. In this particular format, we will bring the microphone to you. So if we could, if you got a show of hand, or if you want to just give Katie an indication that you have a question, we can bring the microphone to you. Oh, got one over here. And he should get a prize because he's the first one.
Don't need the surprises we got on that Friday morning. I'm Steve Saxton. I'm at 3116 St. Mary's Drive in Midland. What I'm curious about is you've talked about the influx of the runoff of around the buildings and so forth. We experienced sewer backup that morning, that Friday, of about 6 inches of sewer. After about 2 hours, it was gone. We received then standing water in the street up to about 10 feet from the house. And I know I'm on a floodplain and been through the 86 flood and 2000, or the 96 backup. What I'm curious about is, in your modeling, did you take that into account where we received sewage backup without having standing water or any issues of runoff in that area? Because like I say, it was probably 12 hours later that we finally got standing water in the street.
I'm going to say one thing on the stormwater side, and Tom's going to answer this partially too. The timing of the flows on the Tittabawassee, and honestly the Sturgeon Creek as well, those are delayed quite a bit because the time it takes for that peak to work down through those watersheds and get to the city, it takes a while, right? A lot of the rainfall that occurred over the city occurred over the previous days, so the sanitary sewer system might peak, and the peak flows and the surcharge might happen early, and then the river level starts to come up later. That's very common when you have a big watershed like that. So so definitely when we did the modeling, there was the full knowledge that the one peak can happen before the other. And I'll let you finish that thought if you have any other comments on it.
I think you kind of he did a very good job of explaining it. Was there any additional follow-up or question as it relates to what he just mentioned? Because, that is truly what happened. And the model does take into account how fast the system reacts to infiltration and inflow. So it really depends on where you're at in the city and the flow data that we had available to analyze that. Because if it's inflow, it's very quick and rapid. If it's infiltration, it can take days.
When we had the actual flooding in my basement, and of course everybody's saying, don't let it pump it out, it's going to raise up in front, but it drained right out. Okay, it was almost like the pumping stations were not keeping up at that point in time, but where was the water coming to fill up the sanitary side to cause that influx, if you want to say. And then it came down, we were fine, we tore everything out of the basement. Never had any issue after, even with the water in the street and up to about 10 foot of the house.
Okay. Well, it doesn't surprise me, and that's something that can happen. I would maybe attribute it to your footing drains because they do respond pretty quickly, and they can surcharge your system, and it can be a localized phenomena. In fact, it may be your neighbor didn't even, if it's a 6-inch amount that you saw in your basement, if your neighbor's a little higher, he might not have even experienced flooding in his basement. So that's another thing that a lot of people are like, well, how come I got it and Joe next door didn't get it? I don't understand that.
We have one houses that got it, all the same money, except for one house, and that one fell.
Okay.
Which you haven't spoken to as
That.
that house had that one fell and the sun. Even though the tide was still set during the storm, you did not receive it.
Yeah. And you can take those measures. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Karen Keim. My address is 7708 Winding Creek Court. And I wanted to follow up on some questions that I had regarding the proposed improvements. One of which is you stated that a new liner to the sewer system could increase the surface life of that sewer by how long?
Well, it really depends on the materials you use, but most of the time it's a cured-in-place liner, and it's a fiberglass liner, if you will, to keep it real simple, and those are basically believed to last approximately another 50 years. And
For another 50?
Sure.
Okay. And then the other question that I had was regarding the storage tanks. To what capacity do those have to be adequate to deal with an issue like this?
Well, that's a great question, and it's a hard one to answer, but basically what you do as it relates to a wet sanitary system, if that sewer in your street doesn't have the hydraulic capacity to carry it downstream, it's going to head up, right? Okay, and what you would do with that offline storage is you would size that storage so that basically for the design event, that 25-year event that's required by law, to make certain that all that excess flow would be peeled off and put into that storage. So I can't give you a spot-on answer, but I can give you an understanding of how it's done. Does that make sense? Okay.
I have some businesses on South Saginaw Road, and I think the problem is the storm sewer capacity, because the water there in the street, the storm sewer can't handle it all, so it pours into our parking lot, and I have storm sewer there, but it fills up, and since it ties in probably to the one there in the street, there's nowhere for the water to go. There's just so much of it. So it ends up having a pond there. So some of it has gone into the building, and the way it'll take a long time and a lot of money for the city to put bigger storm sewers on South Saginaw Road. It costs a lot of money. So what we've done is ripped up the carpet, and we're putting waterproofing and tiling it and putting a 6-inch base so I can handle water coming in up to 6 inches, making a pond, you might say, in the building. And then we're going to stock sandbags. So if it gets really bad, we'll just sandbag the front of the building and go from there.
So you're dealing with this level of service problem, right? So if it rains a couple inches, you get water in the basement, and it floods the parking lot, and...
Well, it's a first-story
Okay.
building. So the problem is the storm sewer is at capacity and more and just can't handle more water.
Correct. And I'm not sure exactly where you are on Saginaw, how far east or west you are.
It's where Jimmy John's is, that
Okay.
area there.
So one of the things that communities deal with storm sewer is that the design standards have changed over the years. So especially in areas that were developed more than 2 or 3 decades ago, the storm sewers weren't necessarily sized for the 10-year event. They may have been sized for a much smaller rain event. Mm-hmm. So things that we've seen over the last, let's say 10, 20 years, is that an increased interest in having a system that works for everybody and prevents flooding. But storm sewer systems are bigger than sanitary wastewater systems. Wastewater systems could be 8-inch, 12-inch diameter, maybe 2 or 3 foot diameter with the larger sewers. Storm sewer systems they start bigger and they get much bigger. So they're very expensive to replace. But in our recommended capital improvement program, we did recommend specific neighborhoods for storm sewer size increases to handle what you're talking about. So if you want to point out later, we can look at the map and see whether your business is located where.
We did spend several thousands of dollars doing our sewers, storm sewers, and put in some more. But it's just one spot there where the water comes in from the road. The other parts, the storm sewers, and what we've got takes care of it. But that one spot, it just can't handle it, just can't handle it.
Yep.
So we're just doing our own, our own thing. So I hope it'll work.
Yeah, I hope so too. Like I said, the proposed improvements do address that sort of problem too.
Hi, I'm Gary Buski. I live at 613 Sylvan Lane. I'm about 5 or so houses away from the Sylvan Pump Station in Snake Creek. I'm not in the floodplain, and I didn't have flood water. I had my sewer back up. For the third time since 1986, it happened again in 87. Changes are made then after the 87 flooding, and now 2017 it happened again. The sewer backs up in my basement. I have some comments about footing drains I'd like to make and get your response to my understanding of the situation. You know, you've talked about trying to remove footing drains from the system, because right now there's a lot of them that are just tied into the sanitary system where they don't really belong. But my understanding is if the system is built correctly, your footing drain should drain by gravity into a storm sewer. The problem with that is you have to put your storm sewer deep enough in the ground for that to occur, and to save money, cities don't want to do that, so storm sewer's too high to do that. So that means you put a sump in your basement and a sump pump. You mentioned pumping in your backyard. I thought it would be pumped up into the storm sewer. In my case, if it goes into the backyard, it's going to drain into Snake Creek or back into my basement, because I'm very few houses away from that, and there's already a drain in the backyard with footing drains in the backyard that go down to Snake Creek. But if you put in a sump pump, you got to maintain that pump. Well, the pump's going to fail sometime, so you have to have a backup pump. So when your sump pump fails, you can switch in the backup pump. And then if there's a storm and the power goes out, it doesn't matter how many pumps you got, your system still's not going to work. It's going to back up into your house. So frankly, I'm not a big fan of, unless you can put the storm sewer or a storm sewer line deep enough so that my footing drains can flow by gravity into a storm sewer, I'm not a big fan of putting the sump into my basement. Do you have any comments? And am I understanding the situation correctly?
I think you gave a good summary of the problems associated with that and some of the concerns of putting in a sump pump. And I can truly relate to what you're talking about, because I've had my sump pump fail. My sump pump runs a lot, and it discharges in the back of my house, and it's the one area of the lawn that's always green. So that's a benefit. But there are backup systems that you can put in place. Even when you have a power outage, you can put in a water backup that basically would run off the city water system, and that would could be used. Another thing you can do is have a battery backup as well. I've looked into it. I haven't pursued that yet, but I'm going to. As I recall, last time I looked, it was about $500 for me to do that myself. And that's me doing it after buying the equipment. So there are things that you can do to do that, because I understand where you're coming from in regards to putting in a storm sewer and putting in deeper and doing it by gravity, which, you know, that is an option, but the cost associated with that would be phenomenal. So I really doubt that would be an approach the city would take.
When you talk about storm sewers not being deep enough, you know, sanitary sewers are typically deeper than storm sewers. And the reason is that they need to be deep enough so you can drain your basement drains into the sanitary sewer. So they're usually 8 to 10 feet deep. The other reason they can be deeper is that with sanitary sewers, you can go really deep and then get to a pump station and lift it up, 10, 20 feet or more, and then, continue on. That's a lot easier to do with sanitary sewer. With stormwater systems generally can't be very deep because pumping stormwater is really expensive because there's a lot more volume to deal with. So a stormwater pumping station is usually a lot more expensive than a wastewater pumping station because you're dealing with a lot more water. So it's really not practical for the city to build a storm sewer system that's really deep unless they're willing to go into the very expensive, very, very high cost of pumping. And that's just kind of a physical reality that every city deals with.
Hi, my name's Dave Shannon. I'm 3203 Whitewood Drive, right in the middle of one of your hot spots. My question has to do, again, is related to the footing drain disconnections. You said there are about 9,000 residences in town that have this problem or have a footing drain connected to the sanitary sewer. Is that right?
Correct.
How many of those are in the problem areas that we're talking about so that they have a problem related to that?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know that off the top of my head, but we do address that in, I believe it's Table 7.1. It talks
Okay.
about the footing drains associated with each one of the priority areas in a column. So it does indicate that.
Okay, so if we go into these areas and try to disconnect these footing drains, it's going to be groups of residences that have to do this. You said you have a capital plan or a preliminary capital plan outlined, so you must have some idea what the extent of those modifications would be, or are those disconnects not included in your capital plan?
No, that was alternative A, and that was one of the alternatives that we looked at to address the, I guess, the design event and the impact in these areas. So it was definitely included, and it's in the cost of the required
Okay, so-
to do the disconnect.
So within the report then there is information about how many residences have this problem.
Correct.
Okay, and you've got a capital estimate for that. Where's the capital come from?
Well, that's a good question, and it really depends on how the city wants to approach that. A lot of times what they'll do is they'll increase your sewer bill and to come up with the capital to pay for those.
To individual residences or spread across the city?
Well, I mean, that's another decision, depending on how the city wants to approach that, but typically it would be across the system. So all the sewer users would see that and reflect that increase in cost, because everyone, it might be localized in a certain area, but everyone in the system is going to benefit from that because you're drying up the system. So it'll reflect that drying of the system all the way through and down to the treatment plant.
Okay, so that's a decision, I guess, that'll be made sometime in the future when we have a little more detail as a result of your study and...
Correct. You know, that's where that phase 2 investigation that I talked about, they're going to go in and take a look at these areas, monitor, they'll try and determine exactly what the cause is, they'll make improvements, and hopefully eliminate infiltration. Well, they would eliminate infiltration inflow, and then go back and reassess the improvements made and make certain that the capital improvements going forward with the more, I guess, major significant construction efforts would be sized and done appropriately.
Okay. Your engineering firm has done this with other communities, I think, as well, so you're familiar with how these things have played out in Ann Arbor, I think Grand Rapids, maybe I think Auburn Hills was another one I heard that you had done some of these programs for. So how did they ultimately deal with this?
Well, those 3 communities did do a footing drain disconnect program.
Successful? It was successful.
Definitely. Auburn Hills, there's actually a technical report in the back of our Volume 3 report that talks about that. It's about 5 pages long. They disconnected, I believe, about 520 some homes, 100% of the area that was having the problems, and they eliminated approximately 70% of the I&I because they monitored both pre and post improvements. So it was a very successful story. Ann Arbor likewise, and I can't speak to the Ann Arbor program a whole heck of a lot. I'm aware of it, but I'm not directly involved with it. But I do know that they've, I think, disconnected approximately 1,000 homes to date.
Okay, thank you.
A quick clarification, or just to add to what Tom was saying about Ann Arbor. The Ann Arbor program was very successful, but the one lesson learned with that with Ann Arbor system is the footing drain program is not easy, because with most utility projects you're working in the city right of way, right? Footing drain disconnection projects, you're on private property, you're in people's homes, and that's difficult because everybody's got a different basement. Some have a finished basement, and so getting it done right is very important, and it takes a lot of extra effort to make sure that when you're done, everything's restored and the property owner's happy, the resident's happy. So that was a difficult hill to climb for the city, and it was not easy. But from a flow perspective, the city of Ann Arbor did dry out their system quite a bit with that footing drain disconnection program.
My name is Pat Blasey. I live at 5112 Stony Creek. I am totally in the floodplain. The drain system and that isn't going to really help me. A pump will never pump out 5 or 6 feet of water out of my basement. I've been flooded 3 times in the last 5 years. I've come to the city different times. I think I just, very frustrated when I saw those pictures of the flooding. It just turns my stomach because I know it's going to happen again to me. I heard Sturgeon Creek come up several times. Does Stony Creek come up at all? Will there be any cleaning out of these creeks? They're really loaded with trees and things like that. And next week, I wish I could have come next week. My neighbors and other people in that area will be stating the same thing. So will there be something done in that respect with the creeks?
The capital improvement program in the stormwater master plan does cover operations and maintenance. So that focuses on the storm sewer system, but that would naturally be extended to the system of creeks and channels, because that's really part of the stormwater infrastructure too. So part of it's what we call the gray infrastructure, the pipes. But in the stormwater system, you have the open component, the channels, the culverts, and the bridges, and those are going to be important to make that part of the inspection program. So when we talk about televising the sewers on a regular basis, the creeks should be part of that in terms of inspecting and removing debris. As I mentioned during our portion of the presentation, a lot of that's predicated on a funding source for stormwater and having budget for that. As Tom said, the sanitary sewer is televised every 2 or 3 years? Yeah. Storm sewer the city doesn't have a budget to do that for the drainage system because there's not a dedicated funding source for stormwater. And so that's the big difference between wastewater and stormwater right now. But what you're dealing with is very important in terms of maintaining it and making sure it's open and flows.
It'll happen again.
Yeah, I hope not, but.
Oh, there's no question. I mean, like I said, I've been flooded other times than last year. And we're talking 5 feet, 6 feet of water in my basement.
Okay. How far north or south of Saginaw are you?
I don't know. I'm not good at this.
Okay. I was just curious.
We're off of, we're just past Sturgeon Creek.
You're probably about a half a mile. About a half a
Is
mile
that?
north of Saginaw.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Yeah, we did look at the state police had helicopter video coverage of that area, and certainly there's a lot of those areas are looked more flood prone than what's like the FEMA flood studies would say. So there's stuff in there that needs to be cleaned out. Absolutely.
Gary Buski again on Sylvan Lane. Follow-up question on footing drains. Since 1987 or shortly thereafter, new home constructions were required to put in a sump pump and could not connect their footing drains to the sanitary sewer. So my question is, are they pumping their footing drains into the storm sewer or into their backyards, or both? Is there a common practice?
For the most part, they are going into the storm sewer system. I know of some homes on Wackerly that wanted to discharge theirs into the state, the US 10 ditch behind them, and the MDOT did not allow them to. So some areas you're not allowed to pump into state regulated channels, but for the most part, any new construction in the city is really in a subdivision typically, and it'll have a storm sewer system to discharge into. And we've got until 8:30 if you guys want to fill the time with some more questions. So for as much as you need, we've got one right down here. Very good.
Can you wait till Katie comes by?
Test. My name is Art Cooper, and I'm on Cruz off of Washington. And we have the problem with the footing drains overloading the system. You spoke about Ann Arbor having done this. Just for clarification, did Ann Arbor pay for the hole in the basement and all of that has to be done? Because that's not a small undertaking to remove that footing drain. I looked into that. Ann Arbor that paid for it versus the individual homeowner?
Yes, Ann Arbor did have a program where they had 2 or 3, well, it's more than that, a few pre-qualified contractors to do the work. So you had the city was selective on which contractors you could choose because they wanted the job done right, but it was part of the program that the city paid for. Now in these areas it was mandatory, and so that did cause some friction, as you would expect, and that's part of the reason there was a little bit painful. It took years to disconnect all those properties.
Right. This is not a small undertaking.
It's not, and it depends on the homeowner, depends on if they have a finished basement, makes a big difference. You got to make sure that everything gets put back in the right place, and it's disruptive. You're cutting concrete in someone's basement.
Right.
That's not easy. But in the end of the day, and our company did, we evaluated the effectiveness of the program. There's a public involvement in the interaction with the residents is one thing, but did it make a difference in the system? And it did make a difference in the system. That was the question they wanted to answer.
Yeah. Okay.
My name's Marvin McDonald. I live in Oak Ridge Drive. My house was flooded by sewer backup for the second time in 2017. We also got it in 1986. House was built in 1980. My house is in the floodplain. We have never gotten floodwater in the house, although it's been close a couple times, particularly in 1986. But I've now put in just this in 2017. I put in a sump pump and a black flow preventer. Hope it works. But that may take care of the sewer backup problem, hopefully. But what I'm concerned about is I don't know where all this influx and infiltration water you're taking out of the sewer system and the stormwater or the water pumping from all these houses that put in the sump pumps. For those of us that live in the floodplain like I do, is there a potential problem there because it's dumping in the backyards and running into local water systems? And maybe you think that's not very much, but there's 9,000 of them it must be worthwhile getting out of the sewer system to help the problem. So maybe it's going to cause a problem with those of us in the floodplain. Have you thought about that? And is there any concern about that?
No, that's a very, very valid concern, and actually that concern came up in the Ann Arbor program because those footing drain disconnections, where did they connect those homes when they disconnected? Well, they went to the storm sewer system. So during that process, when we were evaluating that, we looked at the flow rate coming off those footing drain, the sump pumps, and we looked at the impact of that on the drainage system. And I mentioned earlier that stormwater systems have a lot more flow and volume than wastewater systems. And the impact on the footing drains over a large area hardly made a measurable difference on the amount of flow in the storm sewer. And that's because the amount of water you get just from the roads and the rooftops and the driveways from the rainfall completely overwhelms the amount of flow that comes through the footing drains. Because that flow is slower, it's through a small pipe, and then those are small pumps that are pumping it back into the system. So we didn't find that the storm sewer system was overwhelmed at all with the addition of that flow, because it was so small compared to the flow that was already as a percentage. It was hardly measurable. It's hard to understand, when you haven't done the math and looked at it, but even when you put hundreds of homes together and add up all those flows from footing drain pumps or sump pumps, it's very, very, very small compared to the amount of water that's running down streets and driveways and rooftops.
It seems to me like you got 9 inches of water in your house, for example. I'm not sure what microphone's causing that feedback. But
You may have to walk over to the column over there.
it seems like if you got a bunch of water in your basement and it's going to be continually flowing in there, if you start pumping it out to reach that same level till it reaches some kind of a steady state when it all gets pumped out, that you're going to be pumping for a long period of time. Maybe you might be pumping for 3 or 4 days or 5 days. Now, I don't know if that was taken into account. I assume it was.
It was, and because the pumping happens over a longer period of time, that the average flow rate is so low, it hardly increases the flow rate in the receiving sewer systems and open channels, and that's why it didn't really move the needle, because it's a very gradual flow, and that's why it didn't affect the storm sewer system.
There is an online survey that you can take. If you want to add some more comments, you can always email us as well. Next meeting, next Tuesday, you can join there as well and come with your questions if you'd like. One more opportunity today to ask a question or get some clarification on anything in the report. We've got one more. All right.
I'm Jacques Cornolet. I live at 3118 Valerie Lane, next to Sturgeon Creek. I would like to know if it would be possible to increase the flow of water that goes from under US 10, Wackerly. It goes under Saginaw Road, Sugnet, because it seems to me it's get clogged in there, and after that I think it dumps into under the a bike path, and it seems to me it's very, very narrow when you got such a volume of water that goes in there, and that was, I think, caused the backed up of the water all the way up to Valerie Lane. I got lucky I didn't get flooded, but my neighbors got it.
So the question was about so the flows on the Sturgeon. Different culvert crossings cause the water level to jump up, maybe because of a problem with the culvert or bridge being large enough to pass it, or maybe them being partially clogged. So what happens is you have a buildup of water on the north side of some of those roads because all that flow in the Sturgeon is trying to get through and it's backing up. We actually saw with the state police helicopter videos from the June 2017 event, we were looking at Highway 10 in particular, you could see that the water level on the north side of the highway, the upstream side, was higher than the water level on the south side of the highway. Now the FEMA floodplain study actually shows that there's no increase in it's like a flat line through there. It's not uncommon for some of the FEMA flood maps to not tell the right or accurate story. And in this case, it appears that there's a discrepancy there, and that there's probably some more study that needs to happen on the Sturgeon to see how we can get that water south to the Tittabawassee more safely, so we don't have that kind of flooding. The level of flooding based on the FEMA study, because the basically FEMA has floodplain maps, and they say this is the 100-year storm, and this is the 500-year storm, and this is how high the water level gets. At the airport on the north side of Highway 10, the level observed was the 500-year storm. Now, that was not a 500-year rainfall. As we said, it was an 82-year storm. But because that water level was so much higher, it was basically off the charts, even on the FEMA floodplain maps. That tells us there's something going on in there that needs to be looked at more carefully, or in more depth. So some of those culverts and bridges, some of them were clogged, and so those need to be looked at, but we also need to think about whether they're large enough to pass the flows and prevent flooding upstream. And that's gonna need to be done in the future. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yes. Come over here a little bit.
I don't have a question, but I have a comment. I think you probably all have heard about FEMA flood insurance. Well, you may not know that you can get sewer backup insurance through your insurance company. And about 3 years before this latest event, my insurance agent called up and said, he was new, he said, why don't you just come down and go over your policies with me and let's talk about what you might need. He told me about that, and 3 years before I got flooded, I took out $25,000 worth of flood insurance for about $200 a year, and he came and wrote me a check for $25,000. So if you didn't know about that, you might investigate. Some insurance companies will cover up to $5,000, I've been told, but I can take at least $50,000 from my insurance company, I know. So just in case you're interested in that.
My other question would be with the Sanford Dam. Would that be possible? I know the weatherman is not always right, far from that. To release some water before the dam gets filled up to a maximum, and when they open the dam, it brings all of that flow of water downstream, and Sturgeon Creek gets there and cannot go anywhere. And that provokes all of the farmers market to flood. So to open the dam before it gets too high, to let the water go, that would probably give some retention for the water.
Are you talking about the lake upstream of the city? Oh, yeah. So that, if I understand correctly, is that a privately owned lake and dam? So again, that's out of the city's direct control. And usually on lakes, on dam lakes like that, the water level is tightly controlled, by the residents and those on the association of that lake association. So that's those are steps that need to be taken with that group, and plan with that group what they could potentially do to help. I don't know if there's enough volume in that lake to make a large enough difference to change much of what happened in June 2017. That would need to be analyzed. We didn't go to that level here.
No, because about 6 years ago, we had a big storm, and they told us, I was working for the city at that time, that they were going to open the gates at the dam, and it took about 45 minutes before we started to see the water rising. That's how quick it was. So, I mean, working together with some other communities to see if we can regulate the flow of water that goes downstream.
That's an excellent point. I mean, there's storage in that lake, and if you can drain it down a certain amount, the question is how much volume can you create, and how does that relate to the volume of water coming down the Tittabawassee? I can't answer that because we haven't done that analysis. So the question would be, is there enough volume available if you drain it down, let's say several feet, to reduce the impact on the city for an event like June of 2017?
Okay.
And I think that's worth exploring at some point to see, but I can't tell you whether it would make a difference or not at this point.
Thank you.
I just had a quick question. Couldn't get here in time for the meeting, but my question is, it looks like there's a lot of the study been done on Snake Creek, on Sturgeon Creek. What's going to be done on the sewer system, sanitary sewer system, east of Jefferson, between Jefferson and Waldo? Is there going to be some improvement there? Because that's had a flood in all 3 years. All 30 years, all 3 of the floods. What I'm looking at, it looks like a lot of the work has been done on the north end of town, but not on this end of town. Is that, I missed this study, but when they presented it to the council, I was there for that one.
You said sanitary sewer. Are you talking sanitary or storm sewer?
Sanitary, our sewer system backs up in the basement.
Okay.
So that's the sanitary, and believe me, it was sanitary that backed up. That was proven easily. You got to talk about it if you do.
I guess what I'd like to do is maybe talk to you after the meeting about what you experienced.
Sure, I forgot, I didn't read the slide. I'm Bill Pike. We're over on 2816 Ronan, and it was related to the sanitary, really, not the storm. But I'll talk to you afterwards.
Yeah, I don't know that specific area off the top of my head. It's a 14,000 acre service area, and I don't have it memorized, but I would think that it was part of the analysis. I just don't know that off the top of my head. So we can talk about it, and I can get back with you.
Okay, thank you.
I do want to clarify one thing so you guys aren't making phone calls to Sanford residents. That dam is regulated by FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulation Commission, and so it's more of a federal agency, not the actual residents of Sanford Lake. So they won't probably be able to help you with that. Yeah. Any other questions? Again, we've got another meeting coming up. We've got plenty of other ways to get questions answered if you don't get them answered here tonight. Not seeing any. We would like to thank you all for coming. As we said, this is an important aspect of our sewer study, your input, and we look forward to hearing more from you in the next couple of weeks. We've got August 7th, I think we're going to put the stop to the survey, so then we can take the information and work it into our report in a timely fashion. So again, thank you very much for all of you for coming, and we look forward to hearing from you again. Thank you.